So in this scheduler demo, we'll focus on the cutting, weighing, and packaging line only, so material will flow directly from one operation to the other. We'll also have whole flocks of birds coming in, which we then disaggregate down to fillets per weight range. We then select what types of products we want to produce using these fillets, and finally we need to reserve that material to a specific demand as well. We'll see how that's done. So pointing out a couple of differences between this and HKScan. So for example, here in this demo, we'll have setup times for detailed scheduling based on changeovers. For HKScan, it might be more interesting with, for example, setup times depending on what types of flavors are going through the different machines. So for example, the mixing machine going from something very spicy to something not very spicy, or even constraints where you might have allergens one after the other, which are really not preferred when it comes to scheduling the mixing. Finally, a second difference for HKScan is that, of course, they might have some intermediate storage in front of, for example, the weighing lines. In this demo, we haven't included these stocking points that we saw, for example, in the MPS as well. But that would, of course, then be different when reserving specific material. But since we're looking at using the material directly from the flock, all the way downstream, we're not looking at these intermediate stocking points. Third, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at fillets per weight range. So for example, 110 to 120 gram fillets. Of course, in HKScan's case, there would also be a disaggregation down into wings, legs, and so on. Finally, in this demo scenario, we have packing rules per machine and machine sequence, so going from weighing line A to packing line B, and so on. And as I mentioned, for HKScan, that might be more relevant when considering, for example, allergens going from different machines, or from and to certain machines. So the demo workflow is going to start with, we'll review the inventory data, look at the piece disaggregation from the whole bird flock. We're then going to look at the latest imported work orders from the MPS. And we're going to try and review the sequence that we had from previous and fit those new work orders in. Have a look at our personnel requirements. We'll then sync the customer orders, or the retail orders, and allocate the material reservation to ensure that we actually fulfill all the customer orders that we want. And in the end, we'll see how we can use the system to improve the plan even further. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is the fillet disaggregation from the whole bird. So here on the left hand side, I have the different products, the different supplies that we could expect from this flock of birds. As you see, we only have the fillets. On the right hand side, we have a graphical representation of how these are disaggregated. So you can see I'm getting in 3 flocks of birds in my horizon. So a flock of 1900 birds, 2600 and 3000. In the green, we see what quantity I've already reserved for the production, and in the red, we have a remaining open quantity. If I drill down into the 1900 flock of birds, we then see how it's been disaggregated exactly into fillets. So for example, 110 to 130 gram fillets we haven't reserved for any production currently at all, so that's 468 fillets. We see that, for example, for 130 to 160 grams, we have reserved everything. Now, of course, as mentioned for HKScan, when we then drill down into, for example, the 1900 batch, what we would actually expect is maybe three bars instead, showing fillets, legs, and wings, for example. So that's how we go from the whole bird down to the individual pieces of the chicken for that disaggregation. Now let's have a look at the differences between the plan I made previously and the new MPS updates. So the new work orders I need to fit in. So first, just to give you an overview of how our plant is set up. So we have one cutting line, and this feeds into 4 separate weighing lines that then sort the fillets required for the different packs that we then package. So for example, MKW2 can feed products into packaging line 3 and 4. MKW1 can feed products into packaging line 2 and 3, and so on. And as I mentioned, we do have different constraints on what can go where. This is one visualization of the connection between the weighing and packaging line, to give us a quick overview of how it's set up. Alright, so here on the top I have the new work orders and my old work orders in a list. And using this image attribute here on the left, I can see whether they are planned or not. Below that, I have the different resources and some overview of utilization per resource. And to the right of that, I have the different tasks on the resource that I've selected. So for example, cutting line 1, we see I have scheduled 3 operations, and it's essentially to cut up the 3 different flocks of birds that I'm expected to receive. To the left of that, we have our KPIs. So on the top, I have work orders not planned. So the number of work orders which I still need to fit into the schedule. And this is then also the delta between the latest MPS update. The MPS, of course, also populates these work orders with an expected due date on when it should be done. And I've currently, with the latest updates, I'm at 61% on that due date. We also have the demands reserved here at the bottom, which tells me whether or not I need to move on to the material reservation as well. And with these new work orders, the 3, we actually haven't reserved material for those. So we will have to do that as well once we're done with the scheduling. But more importantly, we have this total idle and setup time, which basically tells me how inefficient my lines are. So we have currently 0.6 hours of idle or setup time. And moving on to the Gantt, what we notice is, for example, this yellow bar on the tray steaks 400 grams. And this would then represent idle time. And if we highlight this work order, we can see what the reason behind that idle time is. So it's getting some supply from the 2600 batch and some supply from the 3000 batch. And actually, the first part of the production in green here is what we can assume is coming from the 2600 batch. And then we see that it resumes once the 3000 batch starts cutting. So the assumption would be that it is actually waiting until we get the fillets from this 3000 batch until it can start processing again. We also have some constraints, but these are related to the material reservation, so I'll wait with that for a while. So let's move on into planning these new 3 new work orders we received from MPS. So I'm going to highlight the unplanned work orders, which filters these out for us. And if I want, for example, I can highlight a resource, and that brings up an arrow of what work order I can plan on that resource. So I see that MKW2 is available first. So if I highlight that, I see that I should be allowed to produce tray steaks on MKW2. So I'll drag that. And hypothetically, if I were to try and plan it on, for example, robot, here we would see the constraint immediately in the tool. So it's telling me that this product is not allowed on that resource. If I want, I can press Control to override at my own risk. But I'll go ahead and plan that on MKW2. And we see a tiny notification as well that the material material allocation or reservation hasn't been done. That's what this triangle means. I'll then move on and try to schedule my packed steaks. And I want to schedule it on the first available resource, so that's packaging line 2. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that there. What we see now is actually that the KPI for total idle and setup time went up to 1.5 hours. And the reason for this is that we're going from mini steaks to regular steaks, which then induces a setup time for changing the, for example, the blades. We also see in my resource overview that I now have a setup time on packaging line 2. And we can see that it is half an hour. And the process is currently scheduled to end at 17:09. So I would rather like to avoid this setup time and my schedule to be as efficient as possible. And I see that on packaging line 3 we already have some packed steaks scheduled. So I'm going to go ahead and move that to packaging line 3. Final thing I would like to point out is that the system has already deduced that the input materials required for this work order are coming from this tray steaks operation. So it's automatically scheduled it as early as start the same time as this tray steaks operation on MKW1. And finally, I can then take my mini steaks and put it on the earliest available, as that's what we already had. So I see all my KPIs were done with the work orders planning, and I can move on to my material reservation step. So I'm at my material reservation view, and here on the top left we can see the supplies or expected supplies from our different production steps. So for example, the different fillets and the cupboards. To the right of that I have my different demands. So we can see I, for example, have customer order lines, dependent demand if you would have a second factory requesting whole birds, for example, and we also have demand for plant production and WIP demand. On the bottom left we have some slightly different KPIs. So we have on time in full at 57%, we have fulfillment at 73%, and we have a KPI for target weight violations that I'll speak more about later. And finally, we have a KPI to see how much is remaining to reserve to finalize the plan. To the right of that, we have the same Gantt that we saw previously. So we have two things that catch our attention. So we have the tray mini steaks, and we have two constraints saying our weight range of fillet is not within the target weight range of the weighing resource. So these are the ones that correspond to the two target weight violations. We also have three of these yellow triangles with exclamation marks, and those essentially mean that we haven't reserved the demand for them. And that's also what we can see here in our demand, saying that the operation is planned without any reserved material. So I'm going to go ahead and filter out all the ones we are done with. And I want to start with reserving material for my fillets. So we see here in the best fit that we would like to add 260 to 270 gram steaks to produce these tray steaks of 400 grams. So I'm going to go ahead and find my 260 to 270, and I see that I have 1,905 left of these. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. However, we see that there is still a remaining quantity that is open at 1,095. Now I do see that I have 2,084 of the 280 to 290 grams, so I could take that and drag and drop. However, we see that it's not exactly within the target weight range. So what this could mean is, of course, that either we would introduce some waste into the process, but in this case we've simply not allowed it. I do also have 2,723 remaining of the 230 to 240 fillets, and actually those are something we could produce these tray steaks with. So I'm going to go ahead and add those to the to the tray stakes operation, which we see is now completely green. Finally, I can use the automatic reservation of material to get the last ones, where we see that with my old plan, I actually don't have enough products to completely fulfill these 2 customer order lines. And the last thing I can have a look at, let's remove this filter, are these 2 violations that we have on the mini stakes. So it says the weight range of the fillet is not within the target weight range of the weighing resource. We actually have icons here that tell us the same thing, so tell us on which demand this has occurred. And if I pull up the material reservation, we see that we're using, for this tray mini stakes, we're using 44 of the 2 heavy fillets for this production, and 33 for the other one. So I'm currently okay with that. We've imported the new work orders from the MPS. We schedule them. We've reserved materials, although only partially, for 2 of our custom order lines. What I would now like to do is leverage the optimizer to maximize our KPIs. So I'm going to open the optimizer strategy dialog, and I'm going to tell it to prioritize fulfillment and on time in full. So we've now run the optimizer. We see that fulfillment went up to 100%, my on time in full at 86%. However, the system was forced to introduce more target weight violations in order to fulfill all the demand. So that was the detailed scheduling demo. We saw how we could disaggregate our whole bird flocks into its individual components. We saw importing Delta work orders from MPS. We saw how we could manually introduce these to the schedule. We saw how the material reservation would work, and finally how the planner can leverage the optimizer to maximize their KPIs. Thank you.